always here to have fun. So thanks.
Thank you.
The lights may go off before they come back on.
Okay, so I think, I see Tom, you brought some slides and Nanny didn't, so I think the first thing we'll do maybe is give each of you an opportunity to just introduce just your community briefly before we move into questions, so we can kind of have equal opportunity in that introduction here. Maybe Tom, if you want to go first, and then Nan can follow, so she sees kind of the scope of what you're talking about and can kind of introduce Dayton in the same way. We'll start there, and then I'll move into some questions.
Do you want me to go through the slides? Or
well, if you would like to.
Okay, yeah, that'd be great.
Just briefly.
Do you know how to get it started?
I sure do.
Well, hello everyone. I see a lot of familiar faces in the room. It's good to be here today and have the chance to share a little bit about the wonderful community of Somerset that I'm proud to be mayor of. I've been mayor for about 10 years now. It'll be 10 years at the end of the year. And it's been a long enough time to, see the impact of some of the work that we've done there as a community. So I'd like to share that with you today. Okay, Somerset's not far from downtown Columbus. That's a big boon to us that we are around 45 minutes from downtown Columbus. There's as everyone knows, Central Ohio is growing, so that's coming our way. We're a small town, 1,500 people, and one of the most significant things about Somerset is that it has a really large historic district. There's 70 structures, 50 acres. It was the county seat until 1850, and we lost it, and so we're like a time capsule with a lot of the 19th century built environment still intact. We're at the edge of Appalachia, so we're at the edge of all the outdoor recreation and the state parks and Hocking Hills that are down there. We're doing better. Our income's going up. I was looking through some of my old slides, and we were the 5th poorest county in the state. Perry County was when I first started doing presentations. I'm happy to say that we're better than that now, quite a bit better than that. And again, I think part of it is due to hopefully the work collectively that we've been doing in our communities, but also the rising tide of Central Ohio is definitely lifting our boat. There's a lack of manufacturing in Perry County. Somerset's 15 miles from the nearest interstate. There's no 4-lane highways in the county. There's excess capacity in neighboring industrial parks. So not a lot of manufacturing. The biggest industries are agriculture, government, and education. We have low educational attainment. That's a cultural legacy, perhaps, of the Appalachian communities. 17% of the population in my county doesn't have a high school diploma. So when as he mentioned, I'm a retired banker. I moved back to my town. And some of those statistics were hard to get my mind around. Our economic development strategy is to make our community a great place to live, to invest in public infrastructure, and make sure that our social services, police, fire, EMS are in good shape. The economic development strategy that we're working on has been influenced by the Appalachia Regional Commission, the USDA, and some other federal agencies that are doing asset-based investments, heritage tourism and outdoor recreation, local foods and craft beverages. And then one of the biggest opportunities in terms of economic development strategy is healthcare. And we've had a big gap in our county of healthcare assets. In neighboring counties, it's the largest employer. Workforce development is another big strategy, working with K-12 and higher ed, and then being proactive in doing community-led development, being able to utilize tools that urban areas use to visualize, shape, and then come up with ideas on how development will look. On public infrastructure, you can see here we redid the sidewalks on our square. Again, with a small town of 1,500 people, roughly $4 million in sidewalk improvements have been funded through ODOT. It's a neat project. We've put broadband conduit there as well. Water and sewer, one of the biggest issues there is making sure that you have the capacity to expand and develop in your community, and having long-term capital plans that implement the right technology, the right engineering. One of the challenges for small communities is you're not necessarily going to have access to state-of-the-art engineers and design people for your infrastructure. So it's really important to get out there and get some help for that. Electric car charging, we're putting one of those in, and that's another project that's supported now by AEP in the state. Heritage tourism, again, we have this historic downtown, and we're next to tons of outdoor recreation opportunities. We're focusing in on arts and culture. The formula that the Appalachian Regional Commission suggested that we've been following is you've got your historic downtown, but it's really just a base camp for outdoor recreation. So Hocking Hills and in southeastern Ohio and the wonderful environment and outdoor recreation assets are really the star of the show. Having arts and culture, creative placemaking that informs the experience there, local foods and restaurants, boutique hotels, craft beverages, particularly for millennials. So we don't have yet one, but getting a brewery, a distillery, we have some vineyards that have come up outside of town. And then obviously you need broadband to tie it together. In terms of outdoor recreation, we've done quite a bit with investing in green space. This map here shows our emerald necklace of parks around the town. We're doing a major bike path initiative as well. And again, we're a gateway to the Hocking Hills. Arts and culture, we've started an artist cooperative that's thriving. We've done a lot in expanding community events, and we've gotten significant funding for art, creative placemaking, sign design, facade improvements, etc. Local foods has been a big investment. We started a farmer's market when I first became mayor. We have a community kitchen and food incubator that we're slowly getting off the ground. Community garden's been popular. There's been a real explosion of local restaurants. And when about 3 years ago now, a business opened in Somerset. It's called Sophie's Tea Room. And people said, they'll never be successful, a tea room in Perry County. But they have been very successful. There's been other restaurants that have opened since then. So we've got this cluster and concentration of local restaurants, and it's just bringing more and more people in. A really neat project is the County Home Farm. A lot of counties have these historic county homes, and this is a project that is a partnership with Hocking College and the New Lexington Schools Future Farmers of America group. Access to health care. Perry County didn't have a hospital. We have an emergency room in the county now, and I've had people come up to me and say, well, could we ever do this or that? And I said, well, who would have thought we'd get a $10 million medical center? So that's kind of the crown jewel of our efforts as a community. Workforce development, we're partnering with the Columbus Idea Foundry in Franklinton, and we've gotten about $1 million in funding for a makerspace technology hub. And then we're working with K-12, Hocking College, Ohio University on career pathways to in-demand jobs in targeted sectors that are available in the county. And then community-led development, being proactive and making sure that our zoning and our land use plans are in place, working with Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission and the Urban Land Institute in Columbus, working with the top architects, engineers, and designers in the state. MKSK designed the Scioto Mile, Schooley Caldwell, did the Lazarus Building redo, the architect of the State House, getting grant funding to be able to do projects on the scale that you're seeing here, where this is our existing downtown underutilized behind the buildings, and then a $12 million mixed use downtown redevelopment that's scoped out. It's critical to have strong relationships with all levels of government to be successful with economic development and community development. As I said, having creative partners that have the knowledge and the ideas that we're not going to have in our small rural town by ourselves. And then finally, anchor institutions like Ohio State and the impact they've had on their neighborhoods, Nationwide Insurance and others are key, but sometimes difficult to find in small rural communities. Again, I work with Ohio University now. I'm part of a rural revitalization partnership that seeks to help more intentionally focus in on Southeastern Ohio, and there's my contact information.
Thank you, Tom. You can stand if you'd like, or you can stay sitting and just do a little introduction here.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Zoe. It's a pleasure to be here, and very excited to always come and talk about, I think what people call the other Ohio, which is not Columbus, right? So just to give you some backdrop of Dayton, Dayton experienced one of the toughest Great Recessions, I think, that any community except maybe Detroit experienced in the industrial Midwest. We lost around in the region about 69,000 jobs during that time, which is a huge part of our economic base. We really have seen this issue with manufacturing really changing our community's landscape. Side note, we still have not recovered from the job loss from the Great Recession like most regions in the state of Ohio. So when you're in those periods of time, when I was on the city commission at the time, General Motors left, Delphi declared bankruptcy, NCR moved to Atlanta. It was not fun, but I think you recognize that it was, you are alone and have to move yourself up. And so the community, I think, really came together on that. And we've seen pretty much a great resurgence in the greater downtown area and a real investment in downtown that I think is even surprising fourth generation Daytonians, capping with last Monday's announcement of the redevelopment of the Arcade, which is the most emotional building in the city of Dayton, a 7-building square block with developers McCormick Barron, Model Group, and Cross Street Partners to build an entrepreneurial center with the University of Dayton, moving its College of Entrepreneurship to downtown Dayton to really work on this piece of entrepreneurship and building that innovation, and then putting those connections from the Arcade, which is downtown, into our neighborhood sites. So I think we're seeing a lot of investment, and frankly, like Columbus developers and Cincinnati developers and Indianapolis developers are now coming to Dayton because the market gets kind of saturated in some of these higher tier cities, and the ability to move quickly in Dayton is something that in downtown that people have shown great interest in. I want to talk a little bit about the challenges that we see in the neighborhoods now. So when you're at the bottom in like 2010, you have to start with your assets. We definitely did an asset-based community strategy with downtown being this terrific asset. But in cities of Dayton's size, and obviously we hear this a lot more in the larger cities, there is a challenge of disconnectedness, right? We're a very diverse community. We're 40% African American. We lean in on being immigrant friendly. we have a really diverse community. And so when you have an area which has a lot of assets, and so you should invest in those assets, and and that's the way to do it, because public sector cannot do it without private sector. The real question becomes, what happens to the part of the communities that has no private sector? And that is, I think, the challenge of communities in Ohio and communities in the industrial Midwest. I don't think there's an answer yet. But I think that is the place that we really need to lean into and have those questions answered. The other thing I would say is it's a breath of fresh air to have an administration that talks to cities. We're enjoying that. That has been helpful just because we need to have a partner in the state for these smaller communities that don't begin with a C. And so that investment and partnership with the state of Ohio, we've already noticed, and is welcome to places like Dayton, I'm sure. Well, you did all right, though. No, okay. Maybe it's just me.
Thank you. Okay, well, you covered a lot of my questions so
Oh,
far,
I'm sorry.
so
Okay.
and that's great. So I'm gonna move into some of the things that you just talked about, and this is understandable. Are your successes, which are wonderful in both cases. I do want, nobody wants to talk about their failures, but I'm wondering if for each of you, if you could provide one example of what's something that you maybe thought would go well, you invested in that didn't. What did you learn from that? Where did you go from there in that process?
Well, I think what happens in communities is what is unexpected, right? So I would take last year in January, the closing of Good Samaritan Hospital in Northwest Dayton, which is the mostly African American community, and the issue of health access into areas, the highest infant mortality rate and the second most highest mortality rate in the state of Ohio, no hospital. So those challenges kind of, I think as a mayor, they kind of just come at you. And so you have to figure out, what to do and there's a part of it where the community has to mourn, and then, leading the community through that mourning, and then getting the community to turn the page to say, okay, what do we need to do now? And I think that's the work of leadership that we have to do. And those examples, when you're seeing great momentum and then get a hit like that, particularly in a part of town that doesn't have as strong assets, is a big challenge. And then that will, that's challenging, because then the community will then say, well, how's come so-and-so gets this, right? And so then you get the how's come that kind of comes the other way, when those things completely out of your decision-making process, come your way. I think that's probably the biggest challenge with mid-sized cities. The other thing is, I think some of you may have seen there was a front line that was not the prettiest picture of Dayton, Ohio last year. And actually I was at University of Miami 2 weeks ago, and I had not seen Alec McGillis, and since this, I think he was a little nervous to see me. I do think his issue of pushing on scale, around scale in these communities is very real. And so, as you see these mergers continue to happen, there has got to be a strategy on mid-sized cities where we're dealing with, they aren't the big communities. And I think you just said this, Mayor, too, like we've got some talent capacity, but how do we build that? And how do we really, deal with it instead of just, and this is a big question for Ohio, instead of just saying, oh well, for the majority of the state.
Yeah, I think a couple of things spring to mind when you ask about disappointments or failures. One of them has been the amount of time it takes to do public infrastructure projects, the complexity of those projects, working with ODOT, et cetera. We have, we've done about $4 million in streetscape, as I mentioned, but that I've been mayor 10 years, and I'm not going to live long enough to do the infrastructure that we aspire to as a community. There's not enough funding out there, waiting in line to do sidewalk repairs, et cetera. So I would say one of the failures is to find a more affordable way or more sustainable way of maintaining and improving our infrastructure, particularly transportation. We're working on the bike path plan and negotiating with CSX Railroad. That's been going on for 5 years now. So
Yes, CSX,
yeah, it's
the beast.
it's a beast. Yeah. So I'd say that's the biggest. The other thing I would mention too is the challenge of retaining young people and capacity, community capacity with our youth and with others is a big challenge and something that we haven't yet, I think, had much success with.
Thank you. That's going to be my only negative question because I think we want to talk about what's working. That was a great lead-in actually to one of my other questions, which Ned brought up earlier. I don't think you all are here to be able to see that presentation, but it was about this timeline piece related to economic development that any mayor, even the most successful kind of set of re-elections, will not be around long enough to see all of the fruits of their labor and to carry through on all of the vision that they might have or develop with the community. So can you talk briefly about each of your strategies as mayor of how to ensure that the work that you start kind of carries forward and who might carry it forward?
Go ahead, Tom.
Thanks. Well, I was quoted recently in an interview as saying that I'm really aware of the finite nature of being able to be mayor and to be a community leader. I think we all have our sell-by date or our, our chance to do it. So it is a huge challenge to try to see sustainability in what we do. And I think a part of it can be focusing at the macro level and making sure that our infrastructure is sustainable, that we're using smart growth principles, that we're working with people like yourselves to bring things that will last to our community. But part of it is the micro level. And I think oftentimes we're focused in on the big wins and the big strategies, and we don't nurture the farmers market and the small things. So I try to, and I think it's a personal, work-life balance. I get a lot of enjoyment out of being at the farmers market every Saturday, actually selling vegetables myself, and making sure that as a community we're, our flower beds are good and stuff like that. So focusing on the micro too, I think, is something that's important.
I think, as mayors, you want to think like all the great things just happened in your term. And that's just simply not true. And in Dayton, the work that actually began in 2000. So I was 24. So when that happened, that was the building of the Dayton Dragons baseball field. And then recessions kept on hitting. And so it was like a slow uptick to have development around that site. And then in 2014, that's when we started to see like real development happen very quickly around the Dragons ballpark. That wouldn't have happened if they hadn't invested, 3 mayors before me to do that investment. And, 2 mayors before me, they invested in the Schuster Center. So there's always like some sort of piece that each, I think, leader puts in. The key is to have leadership, even if you disagree. I mean, we have elections that go back and forth in Dayton, but not, I think regardless, the leadership has always been like not throwing the baby out with the bathwater on it and saying, okay, this part makes sense, let me take it and put my own spin on the development that makes sense. And I think that's been something that's helped Dayton play a little bit out of its class, particularly with downtown development.
Thank you. I could keep asking you questions all day, but we only have 15 minutes left in the panel, and we do need to keep moving. So I want to open it up just to questions from the group here to either or both of our mayors here. What would you like to hear from them?
So I don't exactly know how to ask this question, but you mentioned that small communities, rural areas not having private sector investment. Many of the successful communities have cities have industrial areas and that to generate revenue. But we talked about the workforce related issue, and Ed mentioned merger of counties. Where do we stand on, in your opinion, in regards to solving some of the school funding issues that relate to potential not economies of scale in our school system?
Okay, I'm just going to repeat the question for the people who are in the webinar. So that was a long question. So let me make sure that I get at least the last part, which I think was the core of it, which is that where do we stand on the funding of our school system and the economies of scale around our schools? Is that accurate?
Well, let me first talk a little bit about the first part of it. In 2016, in December, I went to a panel in DC for Politico, and Tom Murphy was there. He's the former mayor of Pittsburgh, and Mayor Cranley, the mayor of Cincinnati, was there, and Willa Hood, the former Department of Transportation chair, was there. And I'd come to this conclusion that it was much harder to be the mayor of Coshocton than it was to be the mayor of Dayton, and really the easiest job was the mayor of Cincinnati, right? So I brought this up, and Murphy, who built Pittsburgh's, river, he said, no, all you need is great leadership. And I said, I'm sorry, if you don't have a private sector partner, it is very difficult to lead a community without private sector partners. And that's really the big question in these small communities, right? Because they had one industry, one partner right there. And I even see it now in healthcare, because healthcare is being, decisions aren't being made necessarily in cities. And so those decisions are just bottom line investments, because a lot of times those partners would make irrational economic development decisions because they believed in the community, which was really important for the community. And even Mayor Cranley agreed that his job was easier than mine, and the mayor of Coshocton would have the toughest. So I think this is a scale issue, is a very, very big issue. But I don't think necessarily the answer is, and there are so many issues with school funding, and thank goodness I'm not in charge of that. The 612 districts, how that's all frankly related to race, in my opinion, is another issue. So we could talk days, but I think it needs to be a balance about efficiency and how a community views itself. And I think, and how it can grow itself. And those questions are tough and haven't been answered, I think, fully yet, but really there's not a lot of people trying either. And so I think that's where the work needs to be done.
I'll just add briefly, Perry County is the home of the DeRolf case, and that's where I'm from. It's also where the new Speaker Larry Householder is from. And I know that there's a lot of attention and a lot of desire to address these issues in the State House. So from that standpoint, I'm hopeful. Just one thing I'll throw out there, and then this is from me, it's not from anyone else, but Governor Kasich attempted to implement a severance tax. And that severance tax was designed mainly to fund a state income tax reduction and partially for local impacts. Most states use severance tax to fund education predominantly. So just saying that might be one potential there.
Thank you. Other questions? Yeah, Alan.
In the realm of, particularly Mayor Whaley's experience, Dayton's experience, when the city loses a company like NCR and it chooses to move, what is driving that move? Do you ever have an investigation to really say, why did they move? What's missing in our community?
So the question was for Mayor Whaley, do you have information about why NCR moved and the drivers of that decision?
Well, I think it was a multitude of issues. The community leaders of Dayton, I remember when I first got elected, and the president of Premier Health and Fifth Third Bank and University of Dayton president said they are not staying because the CEO was not interested in staying. He never moved to the community. He never made that investment in the community. So I think that was a big key. Also, the board was no longer Dayton centered, right? So as you know, we see globalization, you see these boards where they aren't, you know, again, they're not from the community, which is necessary. Like you have to do that for business. But there was nobody even from Dayton on the entire board. So I think that you had no voice in the company at all saying, hey, this is what this means to the community. This is what the value proposition is for the community. None of that was there. And you had a CEO that wasn't connected at all to the community leadership or anything. And then they just took like a huge tax abatement. I mean, just an enormous tax abatement from Georgia. It was even in the city of Atlanta. It was a suburb of Atlanta that gave it to them. And by the way, then they just took another huge tax abatement to get the city of Atlanta. So they've done 2 now since 2009. So I think that was, you know, the bottom line, you know, like this is the answer for us. I'd also like to point out that NCR has not done well since it has left Dayton. And I'm not sad about that at all. But I think, you know, those kind of decisions. Now, let me say this. We know we have a talent issue. We know mid-sized cities, we have to like really invest in talent. The workforce work needs, you know, constantly reconfigured for the state. And certainly we have to do that work in Dayton as well. You know, that's why in Dayton we passed, you know, universal pre-K in 2016 for every 4-year-old in the city of Dayton, because we want to get that continuum right. We want to make sure that K through 12 is aligned. We have a lot of work to do on it, and that is something not going to happen overnight, right? So just continuing to move the ball down the field. But that talent asset is something that I think, you know, is why we invest in our downtown, right? Because what we're noticing now as these, you know, coastal cities, and Columbus is benefiting somewhat from this, they get too expensive, you know, for young people to be priced out. There are opportunities to come back home, but not necessarily maybe to, you know, New Carlisle, they come to downtown Dayton. And I had a state rep, we were in a meeting, and he even said, yeah, I don't understand this, but like my kids will not, you know, live in the hometown I'm from, but they'll live in Dayton. And so like those kind of notes still doesn't solve this small city issue, but I think that's really important for the movement.
Other questions? Yeah.
What is your view of tax abatements?
So the question was, what is your view of tax abatements?
Let Tom go first.
Well, we've never done one, and we've had conversations with schools and others about doing it. We don't even have an income tax in my town, so we're not impacted yet.
So, I mean, I don't think they're the best tool ever, and I think less and less companies are making their decisions based on those kind of tax abatements, particularly because I think, you know, our economy nationally is just changing so dramatically, right? So tax abatements would be great if you're doing a big manufacturing facility, and, you know, back when we had personal property tax, we did a lot of that for manufacturing jobs, frankly. But now, I mean, there has to be some play in it, you know, because I think because it is so ubiquitous, except for Somerset, Ohio, it is so ubiquitous that if you don't, it makes you look like you're not interested in doing business. And that's what's really unfortunate about it. So they're just, you know, they're not as meaningful because everybody does them. And then, you know, I think the other challenge for us is, you know, we are as a state competing with other states around us as well. And so they're going to do them. And so, you know, in Dayton and Dayton region, manufacturing is still 18% of the GDP. So it is still a key part. So making sure that we can continue to build that, even though there's very few jobs and mostly robots in Dayton now, that's a key part of just output. You know, I mean, in manufacturing, I like to say, we're creating more in Ohio than we ever have. I mean, the output is intense. The number of jobs is much smaller because of automation. And can I talk about automation a minute? Okay, so I think too, that, you know, I like look at like almost half-lives on automation. It took like 100 years for automation in agriculture. It took about 50, we're about tail 10 for manufacturing. I think it'll take 25 in transportation and logistics. So it keeps on getting faster and faster. And I worry that humans aren't able to move quickly enough with that change. And so that's like a big world conversation, I think, but it will affect Ohio immensely. I think Brookings did a study of the top 25 regions that will be hit the most by automation. Like 40% of jobs is what they claimed on it. The Toledo region was #1, and every region except for Dayton, weirdly, and I think it's because of the base, and I think Columbus were the only 2 regions in the entire state that weren't on the top 25 list in the nation. So this is a very big issue, and we have to be real that it is scary, that it means that things are going to change very dramatically and probably faster than our little brains can get to.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Okay, if not, I have a final question for each of our mayor panelists, and we need to, I think they have many other leadership duties to get to after this today. So the last question is, Ned earlier talked about adapt, don't adopt. Okay, and as folks are hearing from you all today about your strategies in Dayton and in Somerset and are thinking about how to adapt them to their communities and regions of the state, can you talk about a little bit about your own processes in Dayton and Somerset of how did you find kind of resources, look to other places as an example, and how did you kind of think about how to adapt those strategies to your various towns and city, given the unique assets of that place where you are?
Well, being a small rural community, being able to reach out and identify best practice and things that are happening in the broader world, the bigger world, is critical for success. So a lot of that has been the role that I've played as mayor. I've been introduced by the Appalachian Regional Commission Director as the master of R&D, rip off and duplicate. And I think that's my advice is to go out there, but you've got to take people with you. I was part of a strategy group that they pulled together to look at diversifying from coal impacted communities, and they took us down to Southwest Virginia, where they had been investing in outdoor recreation and tourism for quite some time. And I've been back there 7 times since then, and I've taken county commissioners and others with me. I think my advice is to look for best practices, but don't look alone. Bring your community along with you too, because that's a difficult step in the process, but a critical one.
Yeah, I think adapting and not just fully adopting is really key for communities, because the real thing about cities is they're all different, right? There's not a cookie cutter. The city, that's what makes them so special, is their uniqueness and their feel and their individuality. And so the adapting, taking a good idea and, Daytonizing it, as we call it, is something that's really important to us. I'll give you just a couple of examples. We're getting ready to open an employee-owned food co-op in West Dayton called the Gym City Market. This is an idea that Cincinnati has done and other cities have done, but the people that are doing this work in Dayton are really passionate about employee-owned, because then the employees live in the city, by the way, and then they don't make decisions like NCR. So this whole idea of having these places owned, so that's been the key part. It's not been so much about the market, but about it being owner and employee-owned owner co-op. And so that's made that spin a little different than just a straight-up market. But certainly, taking ideas from other people is something that is constant and necessary, especially as we see the trends change so quickly in our country and our world today.
Thank you. Well, with that, I think we'll wrap up here. Thank you so much, Mayor Whaley and Mayor Johnson, for your time today.
Good to see you, Tom.
Yeah, good to see you.